advocate to get in touch. We're really looking forward to learning from and cooperating with those in India. So I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this panel today with such important thinkers on the topics of propaganda, fascism, gender, social media, disinformation, and the situation in India. I wrote my bachelor's dissertation on how Facebook facilitates fascism in India and the US, but I only began to scratch the surface on these topics, and I'm very excited to learn more from our distinguished speakers. So with our limited time here, let's move on to our panel and get the conversation going. Dr. Anganana Chatterjee is a research anthropologist and founding co-chair of the Political Conflict, Gender, and People's Rights Initiative at the Center for Race and Gender at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Chatterjee leads the creation and archive on legacies of conflict in South Asia. Since April 2017, she's been a research fellow at the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford University. A cultural anthropologist, she focuses her scholarly work on issues of political conflict, gender, power and violence, majoritarian nationalism, minoritization, caste oppression and racialization, religion in the public sphere and religious freedom, and human rights, justice, and cultural survival. Her work is rooted in local knowledge and immersed in interdisciplinary South Asian studies. Her recent works include Breaking Worlds, Religion, Law, and Nationalism in Majoritarian India, the story of Assam, a majoritarian state, how Hindu nationalism is changing India. She served on human rights commissions and offered expert testimony, including at the United Nations, European Parliament, United Kingdom Parliament, and United States Congress. Jason Stanley is the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Before coming to Yale in 2013, he was Distinguished Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rutgers University. Stanley is the author of Know-How, Languages and Context, Knowledge and Practical Interests, which won the American Philosophical Association Book Prize, How Propaganda Works, which won the Prose Award for Philosophy from the Association for American Publishers, and How Fascism Works, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He writes about authoritarianism, propaganda, free speech, mass incarceration, and other topics for the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Review, Guardian, Project, Syndicate, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, among other publications. Ayush Kaul is a political risk and threat intelligence specialist with a strong focus on South Asia. He's written extensively on disinformation online, social media platforms, and their role in Indian politics. He recently co-authored the Tech Fog articles in The Wire, which provided an in-depth report on a whistleblower's account of how the BJP used technology to spread propaganda around the country, hack WhatsApp accounts, manipulate trending hashtags, and harass people. When he's not depressing his friends and family with daily updates on the Kashmir conflict or the increasing likelihood of the next global conflagration, he enjoys traveling, literature, sports, and rock and roll. So I'm sure I messed a couple of those things up, but I'm very excited to be a part of this panel and hear what you all have to say. So I know this is going to be an engaging and interactive session, and I hope that all the speakers will jump in where they want to raise points. I have a few specific questions, but I'd like to start broadly and look at the current context in India and how it fits a pattern we've unfortunately seen too many times in history. So Dr. Chatterjee, I'd like to start with you. And if you could give your impression of what's happening in India at the moment with regards to online propaganda and real world harm. And then I want to turn to Dr. Stanley to see how this fits into a broader current fascist patterns. And then to Ayush to see what kinds of human resource strategies and online tools are being used to carry out this harm online and in the real world. So Dr. Chatterjee, take it away.
Thank you so much, and I hope I may call you Ben. Please, of course, call me Angana. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you whose work I very much value and admire. I think, to your point, the vast network of violence that we are seeing in India today, sort of compelled by Hindu majoritarian organizations, the Bharatiya Janata Party in power, which is the parliamentary wing of Hindu nationalism, and as well as dominant Hindu majoritarian society. This vast network of violence operates against minorities. It is filled with caste oppression. It particularly in the current context targets Muslims in India, and the targeting takes place through highly coordinated disinformation campaigns. And I think that sort of the political relations between Hindus and non-Hindus in India today are drastically unequal, as well as faith-based relations are drastically unequal. Currently, we have seen sort of the frenzy that is built up through the use of social media, as well as on the ground. And we have seen leaders of Hindu nationalism or Hindu nationalist leaders such as Yogi Adityanath, for example, the chief minister of India's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh, has condoned calls for the extermination of Muslims this year, leading up to what are ongoing elections, state elections, assembly elections in Uttar Pradesh and 4 other states currently. I think that I would like to sort of introduce here something that is, of course, very familiar to Jason Stanley's work, that racism and fascism are founded on the nationalist desire to control populations and processes of being, of belonging, of reproduction, and reproduction in its different forms, biological, cultural, materialist, different forms of reproduction. And what we're seeing in India today are militant campaigns based on conspiracy theories that, for example, Muslim men are marrying Hindu women to imperil and overpower Hindu culture. And we are seeing, based on conspiracy theories, the sort of the projection that there is targeted threat in India, both internally and externally, driven by, in particular, Muslim communities that stand to override the primacy of Hindus in India. And it is not just targeting Muslims, it's also targeting Dalit communities, for example, Adivasi communities, Christians, Sikhs, and others. And you have Hindu nationalist demagogues from ruling Bharatiya Janata Party as well as others that drive this campaign. And the campaign is driven both on the ground in real life, real time, as well as in social media in sort of a coordinated frenzy. And it isn't just in India. It also has its branches well situated in the United States and the United Kingdom. I should stop here unless you want me to continue, but maybe have my colleagues weigh in on the panel and then revert to a more detailed answer. Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
I'm just going to pick up where Angana left off. I think we see things eye to eye. There's a global fascist movement happening. Ultra-nationalists in multiple countries who see this moment as their time. They see that this kind of ultra-nationalism, it has allies: Israel, the United States, Russia. Now, one of the objections you get to this claim that there is a global fascist movement is that genocide is characteristic of fascism. People are like, where is the genocide in the United States? Where is Putin's colonialism and genocide? India is the country that most worries me as an example, as the sort of structure of classical fascism. First of all, we have a straightforward causal link between Nazism and the RSS. The early theorists of the RSS explicitly admired the Nazis. One thing we have to understand is that ideas matter. People forget this repeatedly, but ideas and influence of ideas matter. It may take decades, but ideas matter. We have, in the early theorists of the RSS, we have admirers of the German treatment of Jews and explicit suggestions that India should model its treatment of Muslims on this basis. In the case of the National Registry and the CAA, we have what looks frighteningly like the Nuremberg laws. You must really be concerned when a country moves to change its citizenship laws. When you move to change your citizenship laws, what you're doing, the aim is often in negative cases when you're moving citizenship laws in a way that harms a minority, as in the case of the combination of CAA and National Registry. What you're doing is you're creating second-class citizens, or you're stripping people from citizenship and rendering them stateless. Given that citizenship is, as Hannah Arendt tells us, the right to have rights, what you are saying is that what we're seeing in India is we're seeing a movement to strip the rights from Muslims, Muslims who don't have proper documentation, who they're going to be. The map is extremely clear. The reverberations of this the reverberations of this horror that we're seeing unfold in real time in India, these last for 100 years, these last forever. My parents are both Holocaust survivors. I just received my German citizenship just got restored again at the age of 52. It was stripped by the Nuremberg laws from my father in 1935. India, it worries me in India that people regard Adolf Hitler as sort of a great conqueror rather than the most hated man in history. This is not something to emulate. The structure that we're seeing is classic fascism. Hindutva ideology tells us that there was a mythic past 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago, where India was supposedly ethnically pure. And dominant victimhood, which is the theme of fascism, that's the song of fascism, purity and dominant group victimhood. The dominant group is being assailed and attacked by the minority group that's corrupting them, and then and then the language of corruption and infestation, speaking of members of the minority group, as Amit Shah did, as termites. This kind of language we know that there are years pre-genocide, it's some period of time, like from 2 years to 8 years. Recall that genocide didn't start in Germany until years after the Nazis took power. It takes years for people to become inured and used to this. And we're seeing this process explicitly in India. And anyone familiar with history, or familiar, as I am, a philosopher, philosophers have long been on the front lines describing the structure of fascism. What we're seeing is the structure of fascism. And what we're seeing in India is a kind of moment where people are, when I call fascism, people say, where's the genocide? I really, really hope India will not be the case that, justifies my analysis.
Ayush?
So first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. It's really an honor to be invited to speak alongside such distinguished panelists. So thanks so much for organizing this event and having me here. What I'd like to kind of also add upon some of these really insightful points raised is the idea of this enforced dichotomy, which I think has been touched upon a couple of times, where we are seeing these major social media and digital communication platforms be leveraged by special interest actors in a way to create this othering, to enforce this in-group and specify the out-group, and then kind of over a period of time attempt to dehumanize this out-group in order to justify increasingly despotic and authoritarian actions against them. So the first point is that I think this is a common theme that a number of panelists have touched upon, in that how these technologies are being weaponized in a way to sow societal enmity and hatred. But beyond that, I think this is a trend that unfortunately we will see continue to progress, because as social media and digital communication platforms become more and more enmeshed with our day-to-day lives, there is increasingly a greater and greater utility for actors such as people who are special interest actors like Hindutva proponents to leverage these technologies in order to amplify their messages. And oftentimes they're driven by the simple fact that nowadays this is where they find their audience. This is where their audience is nowadays. So there is the incentives for them to pursue these strategies are extremely high. And until there's greater scrutiny, both in terms of a lot of people who are working and exposing these kinds of operations and campaigns, but also kind of a joint operation between civil society, between the academia, between government. That's the only way that we're going to be able to raise the costs for these actors to engage in these operations. And hopefully this event is one of the kind of ways that we're going to be able to get around to doing that.
No, I totally, fully agree. And I'd like to kind of continue on a similar trend. Dr. Stanley, you wrote in your book, How Fascism Works, and I quote, "What normalization does is transform the morally extraordinary into the ordinary. It makes us able to tolerate what was once intolerable by making it seem as this is the way that things have always been." And I'm really interested, could you describe how propaganda is used to create these alternative realities where people may believe their actions are rational, but in reality they're based on this kind of dystopian truth? And I'd love, Dr. Chatterjee, if you could kind of explain specific propaganda in India. And I use definitely some of the kind of technical tools and platforms that are used to do this.
So let's take Angana's example of the love jihad and look at how that functions. The idea, so core to fascism is a kind of aggrieved masculinity. The idea, the thought that, you know, the nation has been humiliated. The liberal tolerance is feminine weakness. It allows it allows the enemy to sort of burrow their way into your society and corrupt your women. So this idea that, you know, your manhood is being challenged and you need a violent response to it. This is core to fascist fascist mobilization. As we just saw in Ukraine with Putin's attack on Ukraine, you claim falsely that that your group, your ethnic group, is in peril, is in great peril, and you accelerate these claims. You say, you know, you paint a picture of a greatness in the past that has been lost, and then you say this greatness, you know, this greatness will never be regained if this goes any further, and then you make absurd and preposterous claims about human rights violations against your group, against you project, you say that the group you're targeting is doing to your group exactly what you're going to do to them. So we've seen this multiple times in India in the past several decades. So you do this all, so your group, which is the dominant group, then becomes the victim. And as the victim, everything is justified. And for some reason, dominant group victimhood proves to be incredibly violent. It's a sort of, it might be because of the sort of statistical facts that the dominant group has much more power. But dominant group victimhood, there's a kind of no mercy and no empathy. Perhaps because they haven't really been victimized, and so you know, the idea that they're you know, the theory of why dominant group victimhood takes the form of, say, the Rwandan genocide or something like this is something that we have too little time to investigate here. But a case like but what propaganda does is it links the targeted group with labels that justify violent practices towards them. What do you do to termites? You exterminate them. And so over time, there becomes, it takes a while. I had a good friend who was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, and she said, yeah, she was 13, and she said, for months and months and months, you know, our Hutu friends and neighbors were calling us snakes, you know, but we just ignored it. It is, you know, oh, well, it's just a way of talking. So, you know, as a theorist, I can't tell you when or predict when propaganda suddenly the justification works and people shift and mobilize to action. Usually it's a core event, like as in the November pogrom or Kristallnacht with the Rohingya in Myanmar. It was the rape of 3 Rakhine women in 2012, which then resulted in 5 years of the Rohingya being locked into villages, and then finally genocide and ethnic cleansing. So it's usually a spark of an event that kicks it off. But the propaganda happens for several years beforehand, and people get used to thinking, okay, you should treat Muslims like termites.
Thank you so much. That is extremely, Ben, for raising the question, Ayush, for what you underscored before, and Jason, for what you just laid out. It is terrifying, to say the least. And some of the things I wanted to underscore before giving a few examples is that dominant group, as you said, victimhood is extremely dangerous because it is also linked to state power. And as a philosopher, you talked about what your concerns are. And as an anthropologist, my concern is also, it mirrors yours in that cultural genocide and fascism are also closely linked before the onset of a physical genocide. And I think that notions through the citizenship issue in the Northeast, especially in Assam, where we are seeing the erosion of a community's sense of belonging. I interviewed last year and the year before a number of people whose next of kin had committed suicide. They had committed suicide because their names were on the list, which decreed that they were not citizens. In one family, there was a grandfather, there was a spouse, there was a 5-year-old child that were decreed to be non-citizens, and they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't know how to grapple with it. They could not understand how that they had, they kept saying, but we walk these lands over and over every day. How can they tell us we don't live here? We do live here. Our imprints are on the soil. So you have a people's sense of belonging be erased, particularly. Then you have the infiltration of masses of the cadre, fascist cadre, who idealize Hitler. And this is the first time you have a prime minister in power who has not actually gone on record saying, no, I do not belong to the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. He has been proud, he's extolled the virtues of these organizations, which are fascist organizations. There is no other name for them, actually. And then you have the cadre, you have the infiltration of this cadre, not just within political parties, but also within bureaucracies, within the police, within the armed forces, within educational institutions, within rural development institutions. So you have sort of a ratcheting up through the slow and then rapid infiltration of these people into all systems of state. And while you have, as Ayush pointed out, the messaging that they deliver, whether it is through social media, whether it is on the ground, every day, communities who are in India disproportionately economically marginalized. They do not have access to information. They do not have access to justice. They do not have access to law enforcement. If they did go there, they would be further possibly brutalized by those very people who they have gone to seek recourse from. They live increasingly more and more isolated, increasingly more and more terrified on the one hand, and on the other hand, the forces keep expanding, increasing, and marching. So that's sort of viscerally, Jason, from what you were talking about, this is what I see in front of me. And then I just wanted to make a few points that on December 22 last year, a video went viral that showed the proceedings of a religious, it's a particular kind of gathering, a religious parliament, if you will, a specific kind of religious assembly, where attendees took a collective oath to turn India into a Hindu state, including by exterminating Muslims. Spiritual leaders justified genocidal violence in Hardwar, a sacred place for Hindus, and the ethnocide of Muslims, provoking Hindus to, and I quote, take up weapons to participate in this cleaning campaign, just like in Myanmar. So you have that happen, you have that go viral on video. And then at the same time, you have a vigilante organization called the Dharma Sansad. Around the same time as the Dharma Sansad, you have a Hindu vigilante organization called the Yuva Vahini, Hindu Youth Armed Force, who hold an event in Delhi where participants again endorse violence, fight, die, and if required, kill, and vow to galvanize a Hindu nation. This organization was founded by the person who is today the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, Adityanath. It describes himself as a fierce cultural and social organization dedicated to Hindutva, the ideology of nationalist Hinduism and nationalism. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who heads the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party government, does not denounce these expressions of hate in Hardwar. Neither do senior influential leaders of his cabinet, such as Amit Shah, Home Minister, whose ministry, by the way, is charged with internal security. In fact, to the opposite, Modi, speaking on December 25th, I believe, at a Sikh Gurdwara, vilified India's Islamic history. And his vilification served, or his messaging served as a dog whistle to Hindu nationalists to take up arms against a purported threat by Muslims to the supremacy of Hindus in India. In general, the BJP poses as an ally to Hindus. It uses sort of mythologies and propaganda, whether it is the Babri Masjid issue, whether it is the colonial posturing toward Kashmir and its militarized governance and occupation, whether it is prejudicial citizenship laws in Assam that have been enforced, for example, whether it is the threat of forcible conversions out of Hinduism to Islam, whether it is the corrupting of the reservation system, whether it is the prescription of cattle slaughter. So you have this repertoire of issues that are used to vilify the other, whether it is currently, for example, the denunciation and prohibition of the Muslim women's right to wear the hijab, to scale up love jihad, the conspiracy theory. All of this propagates bigotry to criminalize a certain community, Muslims, for example, and to escalate Islamophobia. And a concerted disinformation campaign, Love Jihad, racializes Muslims as violent and promotes loathing of the Muslim other. It castigates Muslim men as hypersexual predators who aim to marry and convert Hindu women to Islam, quite like the tropes we have seen during Jim Crow America. And change in the Indian context, India's Hindu majority makeup. So it's also a rallying cry to Hindus to wake up, to keep the country Hindu, to in fact argue or take action for the defense of the sovereignty of India. And this is, of course, based on chauvinist and deeply heteronormative concepts. It portrays Hindu women as vulnerable and without agency and as potential traitors should they fall in love with and marry Muslim men, for example, while seeking to efface the rights of Hindu women. It most of all seeks to weaponize the identity of Hindu males as protectors, aggressors, and as saviors of Hindu women, who they claim, the Hindu nationalists claim, are being abducted into Islam in the guise of love. I'll stop with this for the.
I think you're muted.
Could I follow up very quickly before Ayushman?
Yep.
So I just wanted to emphasize that one objection one could raise to Hindutva is how terribly unoriginal this pre-genocide is, how much they are ripping off from the West, from the white Westerners. They're ripping off National Socialism from the white West, and they're ripping off lynching from my country of the United States. What Angana just described is precisely the justification of lynching. In Ida B. Wells' 1892 book, Southern Horrors, she says, so lynching was as Frederick Douglass pointed out, there was no lynching during the Civil War when every plantation was run by white women and black men. But then this myth came that black men were raping white women. And Ida B. Wells laid out the points that Angana laid out in 1892. She says, white women, this says you have no agency. You can't pick who to be with. This is entirely, this is an attack on you too. So one thing that the Hindus are doing, the Hindutva is doing, the far right, the Hindu nationalists are doing, is they're colonializing India. They're colonists. They're bringing in Western imperialist white concepts and tactics in their justification of repression, stripping citizenship, and mass violence against their fellow Indians.
So just to kind of just add two kind of short points on that. The first one is to kind of give an overview of this process. And again, just reiterate the point that was just raised about the idea of this threat that is constructed, unfortunately, is not just a threat. And this is something, that I would say is common across multiple far right and religious nationalist movements, which is that the construction of this threat, the other, is not a long-term threat in the sense that it's an immediate threat, it's an existential threat. And so when we have the initial phase of the process, which is perhaps focused on dehumanizing the other, basically justifying, legitimizing violence or minimizing the guilt felt by acting out or oppressing the other. And then the second half of that is presenting the other as an existential threat that demands action now, immediately, and not later. I think when both of these things are paired together with some of the kind of black box ends of the technology spectrum. So for example, a lot of research now that's kind of unboxing the power that algorithms have in weighting the kind of content that people see. So unfortunately, they found that a lot of the most kind of aggressive, negative, or emotive content is content that tends to be weighted higher by the social media algorithms. So when you combine this broader policy with these kind of technological idiosyncrasies of modern social media platforms, we have almost like this perfect storm where we have the incentive, but also the mechanisms now to deliver these messages, and that too, not just, you know, on the scale of a television advert or a billboard, but in fact, instantaneously broadcast messages targeted towards a particular demographic, a particular section, and do so at a scale that was not possible before, perhaps in the history of kind of modern civilization. So I think these are really pernicious and dangerous trends that really deserve to be highlighted. And beyond that, also, I think what is interesting is that we often try to fall back on a kind of engineering or automated solution to some of these problems that have arisen. And especially when it comes to countries like India, especially when it comes to countries which have multi-ethnic makeups, you need more people who are aware of those or are culturally sensitive to the issues and terminologies and language of that particular region. And in that sense, you cannot automate that. You cannot create an algorithm that would be able to pick up on these things. So unfortunately, and this is something that I'd like to reiterate kind of going further as well, that this is while we are talking about technology, this is an innately a human problem. This is an innately a human threat to human beings, and not just a technological threat that could be wished away or solved simply through technological means.
No, I think that's a really excellent point. And I was actually just listening to a podcast with Mark Zuckerberg over the weekend, and he basically just said automating moderation in India was just hard. And he totally admitted they hadn't really been able to kind of get it yet. And I think that's very obvious to anyone who kind of follows that. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, just building on that. The problem, I mean, I was in all these conferences after 2015 on propaganda before they eliminated the philosopher and just made them into tech conferences with psychologists. And the problem is you cannot have conferences on these topics without humanists, without anthropologists, without philosophers, literary theorists, because of these points. It's not, we can have algorithms that pick out false things, but that's irrelevant. Calling this misinformation is just a terrible misnomer. It's not. It's about identity building. Communication isn't just transmission of facts. It's easy to pick out, false claims, but that's not what's happening. It's about building a common identity and a common sense of aggrievement. And that's not something, those are literary tropes. Those are deeply embedded practices in society. You need anthropologists to come in and help you there. This is not a solution that people from Silicon Valley separated out can implement. And we also have to remember that many of the largest is Silicon Valley our friend in this fight? Probably not. The Peter Thiel is the biggest investor in Trumpist candidates in the 2022 midterms. And I don't think it's necessarily because that's his ideology. He just wants to destroy civil society. So that's Silicon Valley is not your friend here.
I just wanted to make thanks. I just wanted to make a comment that to identity building, that I think even the notion of the notion of the Hindu as hegemon is something that has been very carefully constructed. And people who did not understand themselves to be in the fold, or people do not necessarily prescribe themselves as understanding or prescribe themselves to be in the fold, are being co-opted into it. When the census is taken, are Dalits given a choice as to whether they do or do not identify as Hindus? Do you know what I mean? And Adivasis, are they given a choice, for example? So I feel, and also that the notion of it's sort of like whiteness. There's a certain erasure and a loss through which one can build an identity, right? You have to give up being Jewish. You have to give up being from another place. You have to give up a certain language, speak that. All those differences are erasures through which one can assimilate into the right kind of white who then deserves, right kind of gender, so on and so forth. And similarly in India, there's sort of this prototyping of who deserves to be the authentic Indian citizen. India synonymous with Hindu, Hindu synonymous with India, Hindu synonymous with dominance, dominance synonymous with both cultural and religious forms of dominance. And I think unless one understands these and we sort of disaggregate and begin to get into it, it becomes, you are right, as you're pointing out, Jason, it becomes very much about, here's a problem, how do we solve it? But it's not a literal problem. It's also an existential problem. It's a spiritual problem. It's a problem that's staring at sort of the core and soul of, if there's something called India, it is staring at the core and soul of it. And I think we need to understand that. And then, of course, the apathy of the international community. When it's election time, we had US politicians, for example, during the presidential elections, commit to actually addressing issues in Kashmir, addressing issues in India. And post-election, it becomes much more about realpolitik, about regionalism, about security alliances, and certainly about access to India's markets, rather than looking at what is ongoing in India. And can one actually, for the United States, I think it should raise the question that can the United States, and of course there are various issues the United States itself needs to address, but can it continue to simply collaborate with India and have democracy remain secure? Because how are we actually today terming what is in India today, the governance that is ongoing in India today, as democratic?
Right. I just want to re-emphasize a point that you just made, the analogy between Hindutva and whiteness. So one of the points, so there's a big debate in philosophy of race, like how foundational and central is race, is whiteness. And some people say, well, look, you have non-whites doing exactly what whites do with this sort of attacking a minority, saying the country is really theirs, connecting the minority with criminality and rape, trying to strip citizenship from them, the classic tactics of whiteness. And then people say, and I've said this, but that's not white people doing it. But the response by Black scholars has been, no, RSS and the Hindutva movement explicitly borrows the tactics of whiteness in the West. It is not indigenous to those countries. These tactics and strategies are from white people in the West, and they're imported into these countries, and they point to the RSS and the explicit fascist origins, European fascist origins of RSS's leaders, the connections between Mussolini and Nazi Germany, their comments about them. So, and then I need to make a comment because I think it's also very important. One of the strategies of and links to Angana's point about democracy, when you look for the collapse of democracy, you look for the targeting of critical journalists. What's happening to Rana Ayub right now in India is a five-alarm fire for freedom and democracy. You cannot have your major critical journalist being attacked by the government, who's also egging on violent mobs against her, doing multiple lawsuits on every dimension. This is not a democracy anymore when that is happening. When your most famous world journalist is being attacked like that by your government, that is not press freedom.
And it's not simply, you're absolutely right. It's the targeting of the press, it's the targeting of civil society, it's the targeting of people to where they have had to become silent, or if they speak out, it is at grave cost. Is the targeting of people so they have to leave India and cannot go back. And it's targeting at all of these levels. And it's also where I think dominant society, the participation or or silence of or complicity of dominant society in Germany, right? There's been a lot of reckoning around what that was and how the everyday German was also complicit in a certain sense that led to that moment between 1933 and 1945. And you see today in India as well the complicity of the dominant Hindu, of caste Hindus in this enterprise. It is a form of complicity, whether even if it is not direct participation, that indirect, that silence itself is a form of participation. It's a form of giving consent to what is happening.
And just kind of to, again, build on those excellent points, which is the first is that I believe that, and this is something that I think a lot of people have raised, which is that democracies are inherently more vulnerable to these sorts of attacks because we function on the need to engineer consensus or to develop consensus. So when you hijack the very means for a democracy to engage in consensus building, you are, causing kind of irreparable damage. I mean, I wouldn't say irreparable because I do believe that maybe over time there are ways to address some of these issues, but at the moment, definitely a very acute threat to a democracy's ability to function. So in that sense, we can't say that, well, China has an authoritarian, much more kind of invasive authoritarian, technological authoritarian system built, and therefore we haven't reached that stage because our metrics for comparison are completely different because India is a democracy or is meant to be a democracy, and we hope it remains so. And so in that sense, we have to keep in mind that these threats are particularly acutely felt, and especially in a country where we have so many different, class cleavages, religious cleavages, language cleavages. So particularly in those countries, the ability to engage in consensus building is already fraught with complications. And then when you create these kind of intergenerational issues which arouse hostility and kind of conflict, it makes that entire process even more so. And I think that in itself is also very damaging and in a way a self-fulfilling prophecy, because as the ability to formulate and implement policy slows down, so does the kind of overall feeling of being adrift, of not having a clear forward goal, which in turn, in my opinion, makes individuals even more susceptible to these kind of like pseudo world philosophies that provide you a sense of meaning and purpose and provide you a clear answer of where you're going and what you're supposed to be doing. So I think in that sense, the economic and social factors do play into this broader phenomenon. But also I've seen kind of from my own limited experience, as it were, working on threat intelligence investigations, specifically looking at, for example, the activity of groups such as Hindu Jana Jagriti Samiti and the Sanatan Sanstha. So these are two groups that are known or infamous across India for their involvement in a range of terror attacks, as well as the assassination of multiple prominent intellectuals like Kalburgi, like Gauri Lankesh. And also they were named by the Karnataka Anti-Terrorism Squad, where 12 members of these groups were indicted for attempting to bomb an electronic music festival called Sunburn in Goa. So these are not by any means, just people who have like a slightly more, robust, like view on privatization. These are, I mean, very explicitly religious nationalist cults that are calling for, the overturning of the secular Indian state in favor of an explicitly religious nationalist state. So these groups and an investigation that I was able to do with the DFR lab, and also there was another investigation also done by Time on this, where they were able to find that this group, despite being one of the most kind of well-known and dangerous organizations, had a collection of 46 pages and 75 groups that it was directly managing and being able to broadcast to 9.8 million people using just Facebook. And using this network of accounts, they were amplifying clips, videos, false and polarizing narratives, specifically trying to engineer, create this existential threat of Muslims against the Hindu majority. And in order to do so, they would, for example, leverage, essentially exaggerate or take, or even in sometimes completely invent cases of sexual violence that was done by Muslim men on Hindu women, and claim, and it would be followed by these appeals which said, how long will you stay silent? How long will you allow this to take place? So there was, like I mentioned before, this very existential immediacy of this threat that like you have to act now. This is not like a far off problem that we can solve through the ballot box, but this is something that involves offline action. And that's also something that's really dangerous, because we see, and I mean, in recent years with even the attacks on CAA protesters, the attacks on the Shaheen Bagh protesters, we've seen the use of dehumanizing language and hate directed online, translating into offline harm. And of course, the WhatsApp lynchings is something that a lot of people refer to when they discuss the kind of potential for harm caused by, hostile narratives that are spread online. And I think that that's why the idea of separating the digital aspect of this from the societal and security aspect of this is not perhaps the best way to go about it, because unfortunately these things are increasingly holistic. They're increasingly interlinked with each other and feeding into one another.
The strategies that you describe are very familiar from the West in the last 150 years. So with Western technology and Western strategies to dehumanize and set people up for political violence, we have people who claim to represent India, claim to represent India's past and legacy, employing just utterly standard procedures to motivate political violence. And let's note that Assam is not some, I mean, I know you guys know this, that Assam is not some separable thing, like, oh, look what's happening in Assam. Assam is deliberately the staging ground for what's supposed to go national. They're practicing there. What's so disturbing to me, one of the things that's so disturbing to me is watching this all unfold. You're watching it, you know it. It's a script borrowed from the West. And it's a script that is intended to imitate what happened in the West. As Angana said, Hindutva is structuring Hindu identity as whiteness. So we know where this leads. And what's terrifying is that the world somehow can't, that India can't look at this and say, this is not us.
And I think,
sorry, if I may just, I wanted to kind of raise the point, which I feel that another thing that I'd like to reiterate at this time is that these technologies, on one hand, maybe it began maybe in 2016 with a few troll farms, people individually sitting in facilities. But now, as we've seen, and as I had the opportunity to learn through working on my tech fog investigation, co-authoring the tech fog investigation, which was that there is now an incredible amount of money, resources that are being thrown towards this, towards essentially using digital communication platforms, social media platforms, to engage in the construction of an alternate reality, the construction and consolidation of this alternate reality that the other panelists have been highlighting in such a kind of insightful way, which is that promoting all of these kind of ideas of this dominant majoritarian sentiment, as well as the creation of the kind of minority dangerous others, but in a way that is being done where we can no longer speak of individual operations, but rather for those of us who are working in the threat intel space, specifically in South Asia, we speak about the information environment, because it's not just about a few accounts now. It's about, an army of volunteers, automated accounts, cyborg accounts on major social media platforms, paired with state-affiliated outlets, paired with state-affiliated influencers. So it's about the engineering and manipulation of trends, as you see, or what you consider to be popular, or what you consider to be negative, or even, the ability to hijack information, whether that's from credible sources, and misrepresent it, and weaponize it and use it in a host of different ways. So one of the things that we were personally able to see through our investigation was that we were able to find through a whistleblower and eventually kind of a multiple year investigation that there was Persistent Systems, a very mainstream technology services company, which has clients in the US, which has clients across the world, had engaged in essentially creating this public-private cabal of actors, including members of the BGYM, as well as Mohalla Tech Private Limited, which is the holding company of ShareChat, a popular non-English regional language platform. So here you see we have technology consultancies, political actors, as well as social media platforms, essentially working together to maintain a an application software, which essentially allowed political operatives who were working in favor of the ruling government to flood and hijack all major social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, WhatsApp, and essentially use this to manipulate trends. So they could, the four main features that we found were they were able to use this application, which was a secretive application used by teams of volunteers, where each operative was allowed to manage a suite of accounts using this application. So they were able to engineer and manipulate, hijack the Twitter trending section to essentially promote content and make it seem as if it's way more popular than it was, as well as trending on Facebook. They were able to phish inactive WhatsApp accounts, essentially using an exploit to hijack the inactive WhatsApp account of private citizens, and then use that account to send messages either to their frequently contacted or all contacted. So kind of the dangers posed by impersonating, especially with regards to what we've seen with the Bhima Koregaon case, where we had activists who were arrested on the basis of evidence that was artificially placed on their devices and then used as a justification to arrest them. So the kind of dangers of the second feature are quite stark. They also had access to a dynamic database of private citizens that were arranged according to their profession, gender, language, religious orientation. And in the case of, and very shockingly, in the case of women, even according to protected female characteristics like breast size and color of their skin. And they were using this database to engage in targeted harassment. And one of the points that was raised earlier was the treatment of female journalists. And what we found is that female journalists were one of the most targeted categories using this entire operation. And we found that Rana Ayyub was, of course, one of the most abused female journalists. And we even had a list, we parsed through the data to find the 280 most abused female journalists on Indian Twitter. And we were able to help them kind of realize that, look, this is not actual people. This is a targeted campaign that's trying to essentially raise the social cost for you to speak your mind online. And then finally, one of the other really dramatic features was operatives using this application were able to auto-delete and essentially delete or remap all of the accounts that they controlled at a moment's notice. So in case any of these assets picked up too much attention, they were able to essentially get rid of them very quickly. So in terms of the sophistication that is being brought to bear on these operations, I think it's very important that people realize that we're no longer in a phase where it's just about manually intervention, and we're talking about essentially entire mechanisms and operations run, including very powerful and well-funded actors who are looking to use these means to further their goals.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very interesting points, and I really appreciate that. And I just want to say we're kind of coming up to the close here. We've had a couple of questions from the Q&A. I just wanted to summarize a couple of saying what can people do to kind of push back against some of the propaganda that's being put out there, and also against what should people kind of tell Silicon Valley. How can we kind of organize around some of the harms that Silicon Valley is perpetrating, and then anything else that you all want to say towards the end. So I'll start with Angana, and then Jason, and then Ayushman, and then I think we'll probably close at the hour.
Perfect. I just wanted to thank you, Ben, so very much. I wanted to also, Ayushman, just to your point, thank you for the quite extraordinary work. And it's been really educative for many of us, paying attention and reading what you and others have been bringing to the forefront for us, and commendable coverage on various fronts and international newspapers like the Washington Post, among others. So it's been quite terrifying actually to learn about it and even to grapple with it, because these are not issues that many of us have been aware of, or even sort of the connection between different caveats, different points of these issues. So thank you for that. I wanted to take one question that's been put on the chat on women and Hindutva what Hindutva thinks of women and citizenship, and I wanted to comment on it, and also to simply say that for Hindutva, only the exaggerations remain true, and that's something we need to be attentive to. and how it mobilizes and uses social media, how it mobilizes and uses the grassroots, and the interchange and interplay between social media and the grassroots is something that allow for these exaggerations to be highlighted and to be highlighted sort of louder and louder till they reach a crescendo. I spoke with a woman last year whose life is forever marred by the actions of Hindu nationalists seeking to avenge love jihad. I'm withholding a name. And I just wanted to say, the following sentences in response to a question that has been raised about what Hindutva thinks of women and citizenship, and the heteronormative and patriarchal terms and around which citizenship is hierarchically being organized. So this woman that I spoke with is of Hindu descent and met a Muslim man in a small town in Uttar Pradesh. The two fell in love and began to share a life affirmative of each other's history and heritage and difference. Friends and family were worried for their safety as their lives became increasingly circumscribed by the illiberal dictates of Hindu nationalists who policed such unions. In the village, people were paying attention, or in the small town, or in wherever they were, people were paying attention to the conversations on social media, to the ways in which social media was talking about the dangers of love jihad and how prevalent it was, and how many such events were happening, how many sort of hordes of Muslim men were going to come and were going to abduct Hindu women. So this is untrue. This is a conspiracy. But while it was playing out on social media, people on the ground were taking their clues from it, saying, yes, indeed, it is happening. Even while if you actually ask these people, have you seen a Muslim man without consent abduct a Hindu woman to marry her? They could not answer. They could not answer yes. They had not seen something like that, but they were led to believe that it was happening all around them. So something that they could not see and did not ostensibly exist was now, in fact, actually happening. So then, in the middle of all this, as friends and family worried about them, as the threats mounted, otherwise benign differences among family and community were seized upon by the Hindu right and became toxic. The Hindu community ultimately turned against their right to marry, and the pressure became overwhelming, and the events shattered his spirit and fractured her will to live. I think what we're witnessing in India today, I thank my colleagues, and I am so grateful for this panel and to have been on it. I want to simply say that we're witnessing elections play out, state elections in 5 states in India right now, and the outcome affects the BJP's political destiny, will stand to affect the BJP's political destiny in 2024. And that in the course of the campaign, Hindu nationalists have used hate speech to rally grassroots proponents and fence-sitters. Hostile messages have targeted Muslims and have proliferated in gossip circles and across political institutions. In the face of this onslaught, minority communities and their allies are concerned about the impact of the results, regardless of the outcome. They are concerned about the rise of fascism and the transition from fascism to active stages of genocide where their lives are in jeopardy. A BJP victory would place Muslims and other minorities at grave risk. And at the same time, should a BJP victory fail to materialize in Uttar Pradesh or other places, will Hindutva activists take out their fury on Muslims in the cause of absolutist Hindu nationalism? Thank you.
Jason?
Well, I think we're done. So, I mean, the time is up. So I will end there by endorsing Angana's points.
Yeah, no, I think we're for that. Any last quick point, or
yeah, no, just to say thank you so much to all the people that were that kind of set this event up, and for letting me speak. And it was great to be able to be obviously on the panel with such esteemed guests. So I'm really happy to have that opportunity. And I would just say that my just small point would be that I do think, and this is something that we should all expect, that the pressure should be put on social media platforms to ensure that the amount of enforcement and resources that they put towards policing content in the Western world and North America and Europe I would hope that they devote the same amount of resources and care to policing content in the other parts of the world, in the non-Western world. And I think that would really also go a long way to checking some of these trends.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to the audience, and a very big special thank you to all of the speakers. Really appreciate it. It was a real honor to be on the panel, and I hope everyone has a good day and night. Take care.
Thanks,
everyone. Take care.